Have you ever stopped to think about what would happen if a child could disappear without ever having officially existed? I'm Catherine, an investigator, and today I'm going to take you with me on a case that has haunted me like few others, that of the nameless child, a story where reality and mystery intertwine, and where every silence may hide a dark truth. Before we begin, tell me, are you already subscribed to the channel? If not, take advantage now, that way you won't miss any of the upcoming investigation. Also, leave a like and a comment. It really helps this content reach more people and further strengthens this curious community we're building together. This investigation begins with a strange call, which sounded more like a outage than a real case. A complaint about a child everyone claimed to know, but no one could name. No documents, no photographs, no records, just echoes of faded memories. And that's precisely where the mystery deepens. How can someone disappear if they've never been officially recognized? That was the question that guided me from the very beginning, and one that may never have a definitive answer. But I had to try. I still remember the day I received that unusual call. The operator's voice was shaky, as if he didn't want to repeat what he'd just heard, a missing child unknown to anyone. No name, no records, no story. The report seemed so absurd that for a moment, I thought it was just another one of those urban legends that haunt small towns. But something about that feeling of emptiness chilled me even before I arrived. When I parked in front of the police station, the atmosphere seemed heavier than usual. The silence in the hallways contrasted with the averted glances of officers accustomed to dealing with horrific crimes, but who, curiously, didn't want to discuss the matter. I asked for details of the case and received only a crumpled envelope with a few notes and the vague description, possible child without identity. It was almost as if her very existence were a shadow. As I leafed through those poorly filled pages, I noticed something strange. No photographs, no formal police reports, nothing that connected that child to the real world. How could someone disappear if they were never officially identified? This question lingered in my mind, like a riddle testing my sanity. The mystery lay not only in the disappearance, but in the very question of whether that child had ever truly existed. It was there, between fear of the unknown and inevitable curiosity, that I decided to delve into the case. I didn't know if I was searching for a victim, a family secret, or a collective delusion. I only knew that this absence held weight, as if it were screaming silently. And deep down, something told me that by following this invisible trail, I wouldn't just find answers, but also open doors to much darker secrets. I arrived in the city shortly before dusk, and soon realized that the place carried a peculiar silence. The streets were narrow, lined with old houses with shuttered windows, as if their residents feared being observed. The wind dragged dry leaves across the worn asphalt, and each crack echoed louder than it should. It was as if the city itself was afraid to speak of what it was hiding. As I walked along the uneven sidewalks, I noticed the curious yet averted glances. People whispered to each other but looked away as soon as I approached. It wasn't the warm welcome one expects in small communities, it was a silent warning that I shouldn't be there. And somehow, this discomfort made my mission all the more urgent. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive. The sunset tinted the sky with orange hues that contrasted with the cold atmosphere. It was impossible to ignore the feeling that each locked door hid secrets that, if revealed, could change the city's history. More than an investigation, it was beginning to feel like a fight against collective silence. Even so, I continued on my way, guided by a strange mix of instinct and unease. I knew that behind that seemingly peaceful scene lay a stage of secrets and lies, and each step brought me closer not only to the truth about the nameless child, but also to something much larger, which seemed to pulse in the shadows of that community. The deeper I delved, the more obvious the strangeness became. No one knew who the child was. There was no name, no exact age, or even a face that could be remembered with any certainty. Some residents swore they had seen her playing alone on the outskirts of town, while others claimed she never existed. The contradiction between these accounts made me uneasy. How could someone be present and at the same time absent from the collective memory? What disturbed me most was the lack of official records. There was no school, hospital, or registry office that acknowledged her existence. It was as if time had erased every trace of this child, leaving only rumors and an unease that hung over everyone. This wasn't just a disappearance, It was a disappearance within a disappearance, a calculated erasure. Amidst the contradictions, doubt gnawed at me. Was I investigating a real case, or merely a reflection of the guilt and fears of that community? The void left by the child seemed stronger than any concrete presence. It was a shadow that followed me around every corner, with every suspicious look I received, and deep down, I began to realize something even more puzzling. The more I sought information, the more people seemed to want to keep me off the trail, as if the mere thought of the child were too dangerous. And this collective resistance only increased my determination to uncover the depths of the city's hidden secrets. The first time I entered the suspect family's home, a shiver ran down my spine. The place was too clean, almost sterile, as if every corner had been carefully prepared to hide something. But it was in the basement that I found the most revealing. Among the dusty boxes and sheet-covered furniture were small, forgotten childhood objects: a tin car, a rag doll with a torn-off face, and a pair of shoes that looked like they had belonged to someone very young. The detail that caught my attention most was a drawing stuck to the wall with old tape. It depicted a family figure with childlike features, but there was a blank space where another child clearly should have been. It was impossible not to feel the absence of that faded figure, as if it had been forcibly ripped from the paper's memory. That emptiness spoke louder than any colored line. The clothes, still smelling musty, bore stains I couldn't immediately identify. It could be paint, it could be something else. But what disturbed me was the care taken to store everything in boxes, as if they were mementos of someone who should no longer exist. It was as if that family had tried to erase a history while simultaneously preserving its traces in silence. I left the basement with the feeling that each object I found was more than just a clue. They were silent cries of someone trying to be remembered. And the more I observed those details, the more I felt that the nameless child was trying to guide me through the secrets no one dared reveal. The father was the first to face me, and it took only a few seconds for me to feel the rigidity in his posture. He spoke little, but each word carried a calculated weight, as if he were weighing the consequences of each answer. His gaze was cold, controlled, almost devoid of emotion. There was no trace of despair over a missing child, only the impatience of someone who wanted to end the conversation as quickly as possible. The mother, on the other hand, seemed to live in another world. Her eyes wandered as if searching for something beyond immediate reality, and her trembling hands betrayed a fragility that contrasted with her husband's firm silence. When I asked her about the child, she hesitated. Sometimes she denied it, sometimes she described details that only someone close to her could know. It was as if she were fighting a part of herself that wanted to speak but was constantly silenced. The eldest son, on the other hand, displayed an aggressive, rebellious streak. There were reports of fights at school, of violent episodes that never received due attention. When I observed him closely, I noticed that his actions carried a strange mixture of anger and fear. It was as if he had grown up under an invisible weight, carrying secrets he couldn't share with anyone. Perhaps he knew more than he let on. As I jotted down my impressions, I realized that this family was a perfect portrait of psychological contradictions: control, silence, and repression. And somehow, all these elements revolved around the figure of the absent child. Their dynamic seemed constructed to sustain a story that couldn't be revealed, and that was exactly what made me want to dig deeper. When I started talking to the neighbors, I quickly realized there was an invisible barrier between us. People were polite but evasive, as if every word had to be chosen with extreme care. Some looked away, others pretended not to hear my questions. It was as if the mere mention of the child was too dangerous. An elderly woman, after much insistence, let slip that on certain nights she swore she heard children crying coming from the family home. But soon after she backtracked, saying it was probably just the wind. This oscillation between what they knew and what they denied made me even more alert. It was as if the entire town had made a pact of silence. The most intriguing thing was the fear etched on their faces. It wasn't just the natural concern of neighbors facing a tragedy, it was a deep apprehension, as if unearthing this secret could have consequences for everyone. And the more I observed this resistance, the clearer it became that this disappearance affected not just one family but the entire community. I felt my presence there was seen as a threat, and yet it was impossible to back down. The more they withdrew, the more I became certain they were hiding something that could completely change the narrative of the case. The collective silence didn't drown out the truth, it only made it all the more disturbing. As I delved deeper into the investigation, I began to feel the emotional weight settle over me. It wasn't just the case itself, but the uncanny similarity to ghosts from my own past. The emptiness of that nameless child reminded me of silences I'd once carried, and it hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for. Investigating also meant facing parts of myself I'd preferred to keep hid. Some nights, lying in bed in a cheap hotel, I'd find myself reliving the voices I'd heard during the day. The questions echoed: did the child really exist, or was I losing myself in a narrative created by the city's collective guilt? This whirlwind of thoughts kept me awake and made me question my own sanity. As much as I tried to remain firm, I couldn't deny that the case affected me personally. I found myself faced with dilemmas. How far should I go? How far should I dig without losing myself completely? The line between professional objectivity and my personal vulnerability became increasingly blurred, and it was impossible to pretend I wasn't being dragged into that emotional abyss. Still, something inside me insisted on continuing, as if the child's very absence was pulling me forward, demanding that I be his voice. I knew it wasn't just about solving a mystery, but about facing my own shadows in the process. And in a way, that made it all the more inevitable. It was in the City Hall archives that I found the first concrete crack in the wall of silence. Among yellowed papers and poorly typed forms, birth certificates appeared with dates that simply didn't make sense. In some, the mother's name was the same, but the registration years were different. It was as if parallel stories had been created to fill gaps that should never have existed. These contradictions left me more confused and at the same time, more determined. Each document seemed to tell an alternative version of reality, as if the family were always one step ahead, fabricating convenient truths. It was hard to believe that such manipulation had gone unnoticed for so long. But here was the proof: someone had gone to great lengths to cover their tracks and reinvent history. Comparing the records with the testimonies, I realized the pieces didn't fit. The mother claimed to have only 2 children, but one of the pieces of paper contained a third name, crossed out in red pen. No one seemed to know how to explain that detail. This kind of omission wasn't accidental, it was a vestige of a larger secret, a slip-up by someone trying to control the narrative. The most disturbing thing was realizing that the more I discovered, the more the contradictions grew. It felt like I was putting together a jigsaw puzzle that changed shape every time I put a new piece together. And within this psychological game, I began to wonder, to what extent was the truth hidden, or simply unwilling to be discovered? I decided to return to the family home and speak with the mother again. She greeted me with a fragile smile, the kind that seemed more like a cry for help than a gesture of sympathy. When I asked about the child, she looked away, clasped her hands and said she didn't know who I was talking about. But then, as if she'd forgotten her own lie, she mentioned intimate details. A room painted blue, the sound of small footsteps running down the hallway. This kind of oscillation kept me on. She seemed to live between 2 realities, one in which the child never existed, and another in which she could still hear his voice echoing through the house. Each answer was a plunge into contradictions, and I had to choose my questions carefully, so as not to upset the fragile balance of that conversation. It was like walking on shards of glass. My father, on the other hand, was impenetrable. He maintained a firm posture, responding only to the essentials. Any attempt to deepen the conversation ended in silence or dry phrases, as if I were trespassing on forbidden territory. This resistance, however, only reinforced the idea that there was something to hide. Sometimes silence says much more than words. The eldest son, however, reacted with hostility. His eyes held a mixture of anger and fear, and when I pressed him about the child, he slammed the door, as if running away was the only way to silence what he knew. It was at that moment that I realized the truth was within that house, but each of them had their own way of denying, hiding, or stifling the secret. It was when I began reviewing the interview recordings that something truly disturbing happened. In one of the audio recordings, right after the mother denied knowing the child, a low, almost imperceptible but unmistakable sound emerged, a child's crying. I was alone in the room during the recording, and there were no children around. A chill ran down my skin as if scratched by something invisible. At first I thought it might be an external noise or some technical glitch. I played the excerpt countless times, trying to find a logical explanation, but the crying persisted. It was soft, intermittent, and sounded like a cry for help. Each repetition seemed to pull me deeper into the mystery, as if that voice wasn't just a recording, but a desperate attempt to be heard. The strangeness didn't stop there. During a visit to the family home, while examining the hallway, I heard light footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, but no one was there. The echo of those footsteps seemed to play with my senses, and for a moment, I had the impression the child was there, watching me, invisible to the eye, but somehow present. These phenomena began to erode my rationality. I had always trusted concrete evidence, but faced with this, it was impossible not to question my own limitations. Was the child trying to communicate with me, or was I being swallowed up by the psychological weight of a case that already surpassed all conventional logic? The third time I was in the house, I noticed something I'd previously overlooked: a door at the end of the hallway, hidden by stacked furniture and boxes. Unlike the others, this one was reinforced with 2 large padlocks and deep marks scratched into the wood. Strange, almost childlike symbols, as if someone had tried to draw pictures or write incomplete messages. The mere sight of that door sent butterflies into my stomach. I asked my father about the room, and he responded curtly, saying it was just a storage room. His haste to change the subject, however, gave me the truth. There was something much more important inside. My mother, on the other hand, lowered her eyes as if the mere mention of that door stirred memories she'd rather bury. Their silence was more revealing than any explanation. I spent long minutes staring at the lock, trying to imagine what might be hidden behind it. The hallway seemed colder, and the echo of my footsteps betrayed that this was no ordinary storage room. The feeling was that something or someone was waiting in that space, suffocated by time and family secrets. The locked door became an enigma in itself. It wasn't just a physical barrier, but a symbol of the mystery that permeated the entire case. I knew that to get to the truth about the nameless child, it would be inevitable to discover what lay behind that marked wood. The question was I prepared to deal with what I would find inside? It was amidst a pile of forgotten papers that I found something even more disturbing: a series of children's drawings, crumpled and poorly stored. The drawings depicted the family gathered in ordinary scenes: the dinner table, the backyard, even the living room. But in all of them, there was one detail impossible to ignore: a blank space, as if someone had deliberately erased the presence of a child. Some of the papers had dark stains, smudges that looked like tears, or perhaps hastily spilled ink. The absence of that figure was so glaring that, paradoxically, it became the most prominent part of the drawing. It wasn't just the absence of a character, it was the representation of an attempt at silencing, as if the child were condemned to exist only through what had been removed. Flipping through each page, I noticed that some of the scribbles were different, more aggressive, as if another hand had interfered with the original lines. Small lines, crossed figures, crossed faces, distorted. It was a silent language, but full of hidden messages, a dialogue between the one who drew and the one who tried to erase. These clues showed me that the investigation wasn't just about a child's disappearance, but about a psychological struggle within that family. Some wanted to be remembered, while others strove to erase any trace of their existence. And this silent struggle seemed to have left deeper scars than I imagined. While poring through the city's old archives, I discovered that the family's history was darker than it seemed. Reports from decades ago already mentioned disappearances of children near their property. Some cases were never formally investigated. Others were hushed up with flimsy excuses. It was as if the silence were an inherited legacy, passed down from generation to generation. The records showed strange patterns, similar dates, nearly identical circumstances: a child seen playing nearby, then a sudden disappearance, followed by rumors that quickly dissipated. It wasn't just coincidence, there was a continuous line of shadows that followed the family over time. I spoke with a former city employee, now retired, who recalled hushed-up stories. He said that when he was young, everyone in town knew something wrong was happening in that house, but no one had the courage to confront those involved. The fear of retaliation was so great that omission became the norm. This wasn't just a family secret, it was a collective pact. This discovery made me realize that the nameless child might just be the latest tip of a much older iceberg, a dark pattern
repeated and protected by the complicit silence of the entire community. And it was impossible not to wonder how far would this cycle go, and how many lives had already been swallowed by it. It was on a rainy afternoon that I received an unexpected visit from a witness. A visibly nervous middle-aged man approached me, saying he knew more than he should. With a trembling voice, he explained that the child was not the family's legitimate child. In fact, she had been brought from some unknown place, and had been treated as a living secret ever since. The revelation opened a new fissure in the mystery. He described seeing the child for the first time near the river, long before she appeared in the house. He said he remembered her lost look, as if she didn't recognize the place or the people around her. According to him, the family took her in suddenly, without explanation. But after that, rumors of nighttime crying and strange behavior began to spread through the neighborhood. This version shattered all my assumptions. If the child wasn't theirs, where had it come from? And why had that particular family hidden it? It was as if the disappearance wasn't just a tragedy, but part of a carefully concealed plot. The more I thought about it, the more I realized the puzzle became even more complete. As I took down the statement, I realized my investigation had just shifted gears. The case wasn't just about a family's secret, but about something bigger, perhaps a connection that extended beyond the confines of that house. And this twist made me realize I was entering even deeper waters than I'd imagined. From that point on, I realized the investigation was no longer just work. With each new clue, I felt as if the nameless child were accompanying me, almost guiding me. At night, my dreams began to change. I saw her running through dark hallways, calling out to me in a whisper that woke me in the middle of the night. It was impossible to ignore the feeling that she wanted to be found through me. These experiences affected me more than I cared to admit. As much as I tried to separate reason from emotion, I realized I was getting carried away. It wasn't just a cold case. It was a constant presence invading my thoughts. The line between evidence and imagination was beginning to blur, and I was no longer sure where I stood. I remembered other cases that had impacted me, but none had ever cut so deeply. This child's absence had a power that transcended logic, and I found myself wondering if my role was truly that of investigator or messenger, as if someone had chosen me to carry a forgotten message. Despite the mental exhaustion, something inside me held me steady. I knew I couldn't back down, because that enigma had become a part of me. Her disappearance was no longer just a file on my desk. It was an open wound that pulsed along with my own scar, and refusing that call would be like refusing to face my own shadows. Over time, I began to realize that the nameless child wasn't just an isolated enigma. She seemed to reflect something much larger, a collective trauma carried by the entire community. It was as if her absence were the embodiment of the guilt, secrets, and omissions that the town preferred to bury. The child became not only a victim, but also a dark mirror of everything no one dared admit. Every statement, every suspicious look I received on the streets, reinforced this impression. There was a shared weight, as if everyone had participated in some silent pact. The child represented more than flesh and blood. He was the constant reminder of what everyone had chosen to forget. This kind of connection challenged my own limits of interpretation. I began to wonder if my insistence on pursuing the case wasn't, in some way, breaking down the barriers that kept the city functioning. Because by bringing the child back into the narrative, I was destabilizing the fragile balance between truth and denial. It was like poking at an old wound, forcing it to bleed again. And in this process, I realized that the child wasn't just speaking about the pain of that community. He was also speaking about mine. It was inevitable not to see myself amidst these silences, not to feel that I too carried ghosts. I insisted on silence. The investigation was no longer external. It had become a mirror, and looking into it became increasingly difficult. After days of insistence, I finally gained access to the locked room. The lock gave with difficulty, and when the door opened, the stagnant air hit me hard, thick with mold and silence. What I saw inside was not only disturbing, it was devastating. Shelves filled with children's objects, but in quantities beyond all reason. Dolls, cars, clothes of different sizes and from different eras. It was impossible that they belonged to a single child. Each object seemed charged with its own stories, as if it held the energy of whoever once held them. The toys were arranged in an organized, almost ritualistic manner, which made everything even more macabre. It wasn't a mess, it wasn't carelessness, it was a collection, and in that moment, I realized that the disappearance I was investigating wasn't an isolated case. Dust covered everything, but some pieces were more recent, revealing that the practice was still alive. Among the clothes, I found labels with names erased with pen, as if someone had tried to erase identities. It was the materialization of a pattern that had been silently repeating itself, perhaps for years, perhaps for decades. I stood paralyzed for a moment, feeling the weight of it fall upon me. The nameless child wasn't the only one. There were others, so many others, hidden behind a door no one dared open, and the truth I sought was beginning to morph into something much darker than I could have imagined. As she analyzed every detail of the room, the realization finally dawned. The nameless child wasn't just a victim. She was the representation of all the missing children connected to that family. A collective ghost, a sum total of erased stories, condensed into a single figure the city refused to acknowledge. It was as if that absence had taken on a form of its own, silently demanding justice. The toys, the clothes, the falsified records, everything pointed to an ongoing, almost ritualistic practice. There was no denying that these disappearances were part of something systematic, sustained by the family's silence and covered up by the community. The nameless child was, in fact, the symbol of a criminal pattern that spanned generations. This realization hit me hard. I wasn't just investigating a one-off incident, but unearthing the truth about a cycle of abuse and disappearances that the entire city chose to ignore. It was as if the child's absence was a way of protecting the dark pact that maintained the facade of normality. And deep down, I realized my search wasn't just for one identity anymore. It was for them all. Every silence, every look of fear, every tampered document formed a mosaic of secrets that now unfolded before me. And yet I knew, the hardest part was yet to come. As I pieced it all together, it became impossible to ignore the community's involvement. I discovered that some neighbors were aware of the disappearances, but chose to remain silent out of fear or convenience. Others even collaborated indirectly, offering false excuses, or deflecting suspicion. What seemed like a family secret turned out to be a silent network of complicity. It was a shock to realize that the weight of silence fell not only on the house, but on the entire town. The fear of facing the truth had turned everyone into unwitting or, in some cases, willing accomplices. It was as if each resident had traded a piece of their conscience for a false sense of security. This revelation completely changed my perspective on the case. The nameless child didn't disappear just because of her family, but because everyone chose to allow it. The pact of silence was so strong that it seemed to have taken root in the walls, the streets, and even the heavy air that hung over the city. As I recorded my final notes, I realized that the greatest threat wasn't the crime itself, but the collective choice to ignore it. Inaction had become part of the community's identity, and breaking this cycle meant addressing wounds no one was willing to heal. On my last night in that city, I sat alone in the car, staring at the now silent house. The locked bedroom door remained in my memory like a symbol. Behind it lay not only family secrets, but the reflection of a collective pact. The imaginary sound of children's footsteps still echoed in my ears, as if the nameless child continued to accompany me, begging me not to let their story die.
As I wrote my report, I realized there was no happy ending to be had. The evidence was there, but the full truth remained eluded by omissions, lies, and deep-rooted fears. The mystery wasn't resolved by documents or testimony. It remained alive in the silence that repeated itself, generation after generation. It was impossible not to wonder if that child had truly existed in the flesh, or if he had become a collective specter, shaped by the weight of hidden guilt. The line between reality and memory was so tenuous that I myself no longer knew what was concrete. The nameless child had become an enigma, greater than any investigation could solve. As I closed my notebook, I felt the answer I sought would never be definitive. But perhaps that was the point. The true terror lay not in the presence of a ghost, but in the conscious silence of all who fed it. And within me remained the certainty that some secrets never disappear, they merely hide, waiting for those who dare to hear them. After delving into this labyrinth of silences, I understood that the greatest shadow was not the absence of the child, but the conscious silence of all who chose to ignore it. The case of the nameless child showed me that the deepest mystery lies not only in what disappears, but in what we choose to pretend never existed. I bring with me a reflection that might also be useful to you. How often in our own lives do we erase uncomfortable memories, old pains, or truths we don't want to face? The danger is that, by silencing these voices, they continue to echo, and sooner or later they demand to be heard. With each step of this investigation, I realized the boundary between reality and illusion is more fragile than we think. And if there's one thing this child taught me, it's that it's not enough to look into other people's secrets. We need to have the courage to face our own. If you've made it this far, I'd like to invite you to reflect on this. And of course, don't forget, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and stay tuned for future investigations. There are many more mysteries awaiting, and together we can give voice to what has been silenced for so long.